Are EVs actually becoming more affordable in Australia?
And what's in store for electric cars in 2024? Hey there. Welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the award winning tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined as always by my co host, Mr. Alex Kidman. Now, Alex, in the latest installment of What Elon Said Next, you recently claimed that Cybertrucks could be used briefly as a boat. Now, considering people already argue that the Cybertruck isn't as bulletproof as Elon would like to claim, how safe would you feel taking one to the water?
Look, Adam, I think the boat analogy here is incredibly apt as long as we consider the boat in question to be the Titanic. The only way you're getting me into a Cybertruck is at gunpoint, and even then, I'm going to consider whether or not the sweet release of death might be preferable.
So, speaking of trustworthy, we're also joined once again in the virtual Vertical Hold studios by Jen Dudley Nicholson from AAP. Jen, would you trust your life in the hands of a Cybertruck boat?
I mean, I can also briefly be used as a boat, but I'm not very good at it. Like, I feel like that's such a strange claim to make.
I would
You just,
rather set sail in the good ship Jen than in a Cybertruck,
yeah,
and I realize how weird that sounds.
Mad doggy paddle skills.
Cybertrucks need to come with a little label, not to be used as a flotation device. Yes. So Jen's not here to talk water safety, but to talk electric vehicles. And it's a segment that's, a market segment that's really taken off this year. We're seeing more sales, we're seeing more models on the road, and there's a lot more to come in the near future. But first, Jen, there's been a lot happening with this idea of range anxiety and what we can do to make sure that your EV is going to get you there and back again.
And Jen, I know you've been writing recently about some of the moves towards making not just more EV chargers, but making the EV chargers that we make more accessible, especially for people with disabilities.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. There was some research around this, and just making sure that, when you pull up to an EV charger, they can be quite heavy. They can be in really kind of difficult to access areas. So there needs to be some more research, and some more research is going into actually how to make sure that everyone can use these because I mean, we don't necessarily think about, petrol stations because they've been around for so long. Make sure that they're on the right side of the car to where you can actually fill up. But EV chargers are potentially quite heavy. They're quite cumbersome. They need to go in different parts of the car. Sometimes it's up the front, sometimes it's around the back. So I thought that was really interesting. And this week we did also see the first 10 of 58 EV chargers go into Parliament House. And at least two of those are designed for accessibility. So they should be able to be accessed by people who are in wheelchairs or who have sort of different challenges to make sure that everybody can actually fuel up their car because it's kind of important.
I'd say it's extremely important, yeah.
One of the obvious things that jumped out at me that I hadn't thought of, but is a major thing when it comes to accessibility, is whether or not there's a step in the way. Because you go to a petrol station and the petrol bowsers are always on the same level, pretty much as the ground, so it's not too difficult to get to the bowser. But the few times I've been to EV charge stations, they're always up on at least a gutter's worth higher than everything else, which I might not notice as I step over it to grab the charger, but makes it inaccessible for a lot of people.
Absolutely. And this is one of the reasons why we need to actually talk to people who have sort of mobility challenges to work out
Yeah.
that these challenges exist. Because if you're an able bodied person, you might not necessarily think about that. You might not think about how heavy these things are, how high you have to reach to actually access the devices in the first place. I borrowed an EV a while ago and went to a charging station to fill up, and I had to pull it off sort of the top rung. Now I'm tall enough, but my aunt wouldn't be able to reach up that high. She doesn't necessarily have mobility issues, but she has vertically challenged issues. And so there's all sorts of things around that. There's also, we've seen in a lot of different countries, and they're starting to come to Australia, this idea of putting chargers on power poles, which is very useful because obviously there's a lot of those around. You can put them by the sides of the roads. They're useful for people who are in apartments who can't charge in their garages. Um, but they have to be accessible because that's kind of the whole deal. So it's an interesting one. And we have also seen, you mentioned petrol stations. We've seen a lot of petrol stations talk about putting electric vehicle chargers on site as well, which, even though some people in the EV community are kind of against it because petrol stations are notoriously smelly and a little bit gross, and you don't necessarily want to go to the bathrooms there if you can avoid it, there's actually some benefits to having them there because there's staff on site all the time. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from some experience here in terms of the petrol station thing because I've done that. And some of them are really good, and some of them, they seem to have kind of thrown them massively, massively out of the way, which I guess, again, for someone with limited mobility is a big challenge. You might not want to use the bathrooms, but nature might have other ideas. And if the EV charger is out the back where the truck's parked, that could be a really genuinely hazardous journey.
It can be, and I've also heard, like the a woman I know has recently purchased an EV and went on a big road trip. Even something that they might not have thought of when they sort of put electric vehicle chargers on the outside of the petrol stations, they don't provide any shade as well. Like, Australia is kind of a sunny place, which is great for solar panels, and definitely put up solar panels around these things and let them provide shade as well. But if you're just kind of stuck either in the car or standing outside it getting sunburnt, it's not a great experience. And so there have to be areas where you can hang out, potentially buy some things so it's going to work in the petrol station's favor. They can go in and buy some ridiculous CDs or sunglasses that wrap around or whatever you do in a petrol station. But there needs
Cornetto.
to be somewhere to hang out.
Yeah, I noticed that BP is one of they don't like to call them petrol stations anymore. I think they like to call them service stations. But they've got a big push in putting chargers in their existing service stations and also building some new hubs as well. So they kind of recognize that the world is changing and they've already got all the infrastructure what you need around a petrol bowser. As you say, they've got the shop, they've got the toilets, whatever, and they've got to figure out how are we going to survive this transition. So that's the way they're approaching it.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't know if any of you have looked it up, but if some of the concepts for, like, petrol stations, energy stations, or servos, or whatever you want to call them, of the future, they include things like libraries and bakeries and places where you can hang out and sort of play areas where you're going to hang out for 20 minutes, and buy your goods or read your book or your magazine or what have you. I love that concept. That's something that the likes of BP and Ampol have said that they're going to think about these things. They're creating concepts about these, and both of those big sort of petrol retailers have said that they're going to roll out more EV chargers in Australia, simply because that's the way the market's going. They like to be able to sell people power, and it makes sense seeing as they've got all of this investment in real estate in Australia.
So one of the things that we're seeing now, and certainly this has improved over the past couple of years, is there are now more between point charges. It's possible to get further and further in most EVs with existing chargers, but we are starting to hit a bit of an issue around the numbers of chargers in a point. Is this getting any better? Is there stuff on the horizon that's going to improve this, especially for those much longer journeys that some Australians like to take?
Yeah, it is improving, but it's one of those things where I think a lot of companies are still in the sort of the trial phase of this, and they want to see. Unfortunately, something has to go bad for them to work out. Oh, okay, we need more charging points at this particular location, and they also have to get approvals. They have to be able to make sure that they've got sort of access to enough electricity supply at these places. That can take time to operate. Um, some of the people I've spoken to, some of the companies are saying that it takes about 18 months from I want to put an EV charger in to I've got all of the approvals, I can roll out the equipment, I can install this thing, it's ready to go. That's not a really quick time. That's the kind of speed at which government normally moves. And so, yes, we're definitely kind of identifying the problems now and they're being solved, but some of the problems won't be solved immediately. I think you are seeing now, though, that people who want to go on longer road trips with their electric vehicle, and why not? They're incredibly comfortable and they've got a hell of a lot of torque. Um, I think that they're finding it more easy to get to places, and spending less time planning, because so much of this is about where's the nearest charger, where
Mm.
is the backup charger, where can I go to make sure that this is within range of my vehicle. If it's a particularly hot day or a particularly cold day, like what are my plans for this. I think it's becoming better, and that's really heartening to see. I've got I was considering taking an EV out, sort of western, like Toowoomba way in Queensland. There's one right near a bakery, and so I know what I'm eating for lunch. Like, that was very convenient, and I really wanna see more of this where, some of the local businesses in regional areas go, "You know what? Here's an opportunity. I'm gonna make sure that, companies know that they can put this near my place of business, and I'm gonna get a whole lot of rich people in EVs rock up and buy my baked goods." So, yes, everyone wins.
You kind of already see that with petrol stations, though. When you have got petrol stations on the major freeways or major highways between towns and stuff, it's not just a petrol station on its own. There is already that ecosystem of, we have our special branded cafe, we have sorry, we have a shop and this and that. So we've already got that concept there of, I think BP wants to call it a giga hub, where you've got, rows and rows of places to fill up and a whole lot of stuff to do.
I think what's really interesting is that potentially you're captured there for a longer period. So
Yeah.
when you fuel up a car, you're done within 5 minutes, and that you're in there, you're grabbing something. You might go to the bathroom, but you're not necessarily captive there for a decent period of time. When you're fueling up an electric vehicle, if you really want to put 80% charge into this thing, then potentially you're going to be sticking around for at least 20 to 30 minutes. And so there's an opportunity there for other businesses to come in and say, "You're there for 20 to 30 minutes. I can make you a toasted sandwich, make sure it's nice and warm, have you eat it without burning your mouth, and then you can go after that." So it changes, even though it's only sort of a slight change in your plans. I think it changes the opportunity for businesses.
And the two observations I'll make on that is it doesn't necessarily as massively change your timing as you might think, because so many of these systems are automated. So you're not actually waiting to pay at a service station till, for example. But also, some of the concepts, certainly that have been rolled out in the UK, are really fascinating around this. I mean, Jen, you mentioned kind of, bookstores and so on. There are places that have got 24-hour gyms, so instead of just like stretching your legs, you can actually work them out while your car charges. There's some really fascinating business opportunities. But you're right, the tourism impact thing is definitely also a bit of a story there. One of the other issues, though, around this whole charger thing is reliability. And I noticed that one of the bigger manufacturers of EV charging stations, and actually in your neck of the woods as well, Jen, is ceasing production. What's happened to tritium? I think it's pronounced.
Yeah, for some reason, everybody calls it trinium, even though there's an extra T in it. I'm not really sure what that's about, and I don't necessarily think that'll be solved by moving to America. But basically, trinium had talked about moving to the US because there was more money in it, which is probably not surprising for a technology company. It was surprising to me that they were based in Brisbane, and it was really nice to see. So it is disappointing that they're talking about moving now. They were keen to get more support from the Queensland government, from the federal government, as I understand it. And so they're going where the money is. I know that they've got a bit of a poor reputation when it comes to uptime, especially from electric vehicle drivers. I have talked to some of the executives from the company about that, and they argue that it's actually it's not their equipment, but it's some of the contracts that they go into around maintenance, because they'll maintain it for a certain period of time, and then whatever company installs their equipment actually has to pay for a maintenance contract or do the maintenance themselves, and have equipment on hand so that it can be fixed. And I feel for them in that, because I think that once that reputation gets out there, people can become quite critical, because if you're left stranded somewhere, then of course you're going to be angry about it. So it's an interesting one. I'm disappointed that they're leaving. I think that it was a very rare time to see some a company in any sort of tech space doing well out of Brisbane.
Would that be part of, is it Biden's got the Inflation Reduction Act or something, and they're just throwing billions of dollars into things like renewables, and they're worried that that's exactly what it's going to do. It's going to draw in all these companies and all this investment from around the world and suck it all into the US at our expense.
Potentially, and they really are throwing a lot of money behind it. I think that it's a smart thing to do ultimately. Australia has a lot of advantages when it comes to renewable energy. We've got a whole lot of natural resources that can be tapped into. So it would make sense if we made some more investment here, but I'm not a policymaker and I just report on them.
So, do we have, and I genuinely don't know the answer to this question, always a dangerous way to start any question. Do we have any larger scale, like tritium level EV manufacturers? Obviously, we do not have a car industry here anymore, but do we have anyone who's making parts, or is it all just those kind of smaller mobs doing EV conversions of combi vans and the like?
It's not necessarily smaller mobs. Like we've got some companies over here who manufacture electric buses, for example. We've seen Volvo make a commitment again out of Brisbane. I don't know why we're representing so hard, but that they've made a commitment that at some point they will start manufacturing electric trucks here, and we're talking about some really reasonably sized trucks as well to be going on our roads and taking a lot of carbon off the roads as a result because they're otherwise chewing through the diesel quite heavily. There are some conversions, and I think some of those conversion companies, though, it would be wrong to think of them as a cottage industry. There are a couple of companies that have teamed to take sort of the hull of some utes and actually turn them electric. And one of those had like 8,000 orders or something ridiculous to be used on
Ooh.
mining sites. That's not a small order. That's really quite substantial and was taken up quite quickly. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity. We've also, this is really interesting. We've got a 130-meter ferry that's being electric ferry that's being built in Tasmania. And it's actually being built for some South American firms, so it's going to be used as a ferry over there. We are manufacturing stuff, but it's not the shiny cars and necessarily the electric chargers like you might expect.
Batteries is probably where we need to get in on the ground floor. I mean, we dig up lithium and we don't even process it. Like the bulk of the world's lithium processing is done in China. If we even did more of the processing here, let alone actually making the batteries, then we could get a bigger slice of the pie.
Yeah, it's not that sexy to talk about, but we have absolute shed loads of lithium in Australia. Like
Yes.
when you have a look at it, like we're basically the world's leader in terms of actually getting the stuff, but we don't process it. We don't make it into batteries. Tesla loves us because they get so much lithium from Australia. And like one of their Australian executives has come out and said Australia needs to be taking advantage of this. I think that we would be very smart to be taking that advice because we have an awful lot of it and the world is going to need an awful lot of it because by 2035 it's most likely that all the people on this call will be driving an EV.
Well, speaking of driving an EV, we've also had some information about new models and even a brand, I believe, reappearing in Australia. No sign of Natalie Cole, but the Cadillac is making a comeback in Australia. Jen, tell me about this.
First of all, I need to discuss your references. Like seriously, who's getting this? You're not appealing to the millennials, Alex.
I
Any
was going to bring up that that was originally a Bruce Springsteen track.
I was
So,
going to say, you got to decide which millennium you're trying to appeal to.
exactly.
You're making it older.
I don't think the Australian millennials are that into Cadillacs to speak of. So I don't feel that was that much of a misfire, but I'm sure the listeners can let me know.
That'll be interesting. Um, this is real. This I found really fun. So Cadillac apparently the last time that they were in Australia being sold was 1969. So right around the moon landing time. So maybe not necessarily as current for all listeners. Some of us weren't alive. Um, so
Indeed.
they've tried apparently a couple of times to make a comeback in Australia. It's been a long time coming. It's been more than 50 years. Apparently, they tried around the GFC, slight little issue. Nobody had any cash. Then they tried again around 2020, slight little issue. Nobody was out driving their cars because some of us weren't allowed to. So this time for sure, they've come to Australia. They're saying that next year they're going to start selling an electric SUV and a very fancy one. We're talking about probably more than $100,000. I've seen reports that maybe around $140,000. It's called the Lyric, and it's got a whopping great screen that goes right across the front of it. looks very high end and luxury. So whether Australia needs another high end luxury SUV is up to buyers to decide, I suppose.
And what's happening with EV sales in general? I think I saw it's getting up to nearly 1 in 10 new cars now.
Yeah, so it's pretty impressive. At the moment, it's fallen slightly in the past month, and I think that was slightly that was potentially because the Tesla Model 3 was announced, and so people aren't necessarily getting the same flow through of Teslas. They're not expected until I think early next year. And a
That's
lot
the
of
refresh Model 3, right?
it, the
The Model 3
refresh
already
model,
exists. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
exactly. So much of Australia's market is Teslas. It's still a
Mm.
really dominant brand in terms of electric vehicles. So last month in October, it was around 5.7% of all new car sales were electric. But this year we've seen that go as high as 8%. That's a huge difference from last year. So it's basically triple the number of electric vehicles that were sold last year are being sold this year. Um, in my street, I can report that there's 4 electric cars. Not that I'm watching everybody's
And
driveways.
you're reviewing 3 of them?
Sadly, unless I can steal the keys from various people, no, not yet. But leave it with me. So we're definitely seeing more of them on the road, and there's definitely more brands available too. So we've seen the BYD Dolphin is now out on the roads and being delivered. That's an electric hatchback. And is currently, as I understand it, the cheapest on the market, even though it's by a margin of about $100. We've seen sort of more MG4s out in the wild. I think there were about 700 of those that were sold during October. So that's starting to flow through the system. And also, even in sort of the second-hand market, I've seen a bit of movement there and people buying them, which don't get captured by this sort of new sales figure number. But definitely, we're starting to see that flow through.
Is there much of a secondhand sales? Because I would think that the real question mark over secondhand EV would be the battery. Is there much insight into how these batteries are faring? So when you buy a secondhand EV, you know what you're getting?
Yeah, I think it's a question for people. I think the battery is the main thing that you have to look at though. So when you buy a secondhand car, there can be heaps wrong with it. Like there can be things wrong with it that you've never even heard of before. And I'm talking specifically about, experiences I've had in the past. Um, there's not that many moving parts in an electric vehicle. So it's mainly the battery you have to be concerned about. The manufacturer's warranties typically go for about 8 years, so they're really confident that, at the end of that 8 years, there'll still be quite a high percentage of charge, and I think what we've seen from the likes of Nissan Leaf, like, there's Nissan Leafs on the road that are still going after 20 years, and they're still using their original battery, and it does degrade over time, but it doesn't become unusable. It might lose some of its range. So I don't think it's the concern that people necessarily place on it. If we're talking about a 10-year-old car, then you're bound to have some questions about it anyway. There are ways with these vehicles that you could actually test what the health of their battery, just like you can test the health of your iPad's battery. And I think that needs to become more commonplace as part of it. But certainly from the vehicles that we've seen that are kind of being passed down through the system so far, I haven't seen a lot of complaints about secondhand electric vehicles.
So I did a bit of research for this one because I was curious, and as the listeners will know, I drive EVs only, and I've got a Leaf, a lovely little vehicle, and it's really surprising how far some of the prices have dropped. And I think that's the pressure of your MG4s and the like coming down as well. So there's a lot of affordable models out there, and I think we are hitting that inflection point where there's actually stock of these things for people to buy. I mean, I dug around one particular site, and I don't want to give any one particular car sales site prominence over another, but I dug around one particular site. Have a guess at the cheapest EV I could find, just the rough price point of the cheapest EV that I could find for sale in Australia right now. Adam,
Secondhand?
yes,
Yeah.
secondhand. Oh, side lid,
10 grand maybe?
$6,500.
Six and a
What?
half thousand dollars.
What are you going to get for six
Six and a
grand?
half, 6.5 grand will buy you a 2011 Mitsubishi i-MiEV.
Ooh.
They did not, however, have a lot of detail on what the battery condition was like. But if you stepped up to about 12 to 14, I started to see a lot of Nissan Leafs, kind of 2012 to 2016 vintage. And a lot of those were really upfront about the expected battery and the expected range that you could get. And nearly all of them fit within the typical range that Australian cars actually drive. Because people often sort of get this wrong. Most people do not drive 1,000 kilometers a day, and short, there are people who do. Most people do like 30 to 40 kilometers. They'll do that in a heartbeat.
Mm.
Mm. That's really interesting. There's a car, again, not to promote it, but there's a firm called the Good Car Company that actually imports some of these vehicles and some of the old Nissan Leafs and some other ones that people might not have heard of. And they recondition them and they make sure that their batteries are tested, and they'll give you a full report on their health before you actually purchase them. And I think that gives people a lot more assurance. I think we need to see a bit more of that behavior in the market. But certainly when it comes to range, like whenever I pull up to an electric vehicle charge point while I'm testing a car, I will invariably get a man come up to me and say, "How often do you need to charge it? How much does it cost? How much does it tow?" I've never towed a damn thing in my life. It cost me all of $10 when I plugged, a vehicle in one time. Like, that's as much as I could physically pay for the vehicle. And in terms of how far do they go, I think you have to be aware of, like Alex said, exactly how far you're traveling every day, because most people don't do as much as they think. And certainly, I think the range of most of them, the new vehicles will go, at least 300 kilometers. It's pretty rare that we do that in a
Mm.
day.
So it's really only when you're doing the occasional interstate haul that you need to think about these kinds of things. And then, as we said, it's already along the major freeways, along the Hume and whatever. So the Pacific Highway is it that goes up to Brisbane. So you shouldn't have too much trouble getting between the major cities.
No, and if I go to the Sunshine Coast and back, that's 170 k's max. So I can do that almost twice before I have to be concerned about anything. I think that people really overestimate exactly how far they go and how fun they are.
And look, I'll say, as someone who owns a 2016 Leaf, I could do that Sunshine Road trip in my Leaf, but I'd have to charge when I got there, to be fair. And that's a smaller, older, much, much cheaper EV. Um, the other point actually I wanted to bring up on the charging thing and around the Pacific Highway specifically was and this just has happened since the last time we chatted to you about EVs, Jen, was Tesla opening up about half of its EVs, but really notably for the Pacific Highway, which I believe still holds the record as being Australia's busiest stretch of highway, like Brisbane all the way down to Melbourne, basically. Um, that's the one stretch where basically Tesla said, "Nah, these are all Tesla only." So it is getting better for everyone, but it's still slightly more limited along that route if if you're in a different EV, if you're in another brand EV.
And I think that's Tesla sort of maintaining its competitive advantage, which I understand. They did pay for these things. They rolled them out. They are, notoriously reliable. So I can understand them, keeping some back for themselves. It is going to be interesting to see what the behavior is like over Christmas, because it's that period directly after Christmas
Mm,
where most people have time off, and where we saw quite a few sort of holdups last year around those major routes, especially around the Pacific Highway, areas between Sydney and Melbourne. We saw photographs of people being very angry because they had to wait to charge up their vehicles, which again, understandable. So it's going to be interesting to see this year whether that's improved because some of these manufacturers have more information about where the hotspots are, or whether they're not going to have rolled out enough because so many more people this year have electric vehicles than did last year.
Is the government doing anything about this, or are they leaving it all to a private enterprise?
They're not rolling them out themselves, although the state governments are paying for some. I think in terms of the federal government, they work through ARENA, which is the Australian Renewable Energy something or other, and they're sort of co-funding a lot of these things, and so they're assisting with that. There's also some assistance from state government. In Queensland, they've announced that they're installing a whole lot of electric vehicle chargers up this electric superhighway, but a lot of them will not be made public, which I thought was very strange. So it's kind of a network for public servants. Some of them will be for the public. So that was an interesting strategy, and I hope maybe that changes like Tesla in future, and we see some of those open up. So it's a bit of a half and half experience. We have seen some larger companies come out in Australia as well. So like EV Networks is quite large. We've got sort of the ChargeFox network, so you can look some of these up and access them. Jolt is making a bit of a run for it, although not as much in some states as others. And so we're starting to see some of these larger companies emerge and take on the challenge because there's going to be more money in it.
Yeah, PlugShare is a really good website for looking at that.
And
It'll bring
apps.
you
Yeah.
up a map and app, and it'll show you a lot. But it is interesting because I had to write about the coverage of EV chargers in Melbourne and Sydney, so I was looking at PlugShare, and it's interesting how they've favored certain suburbs. We'll say leafy suburbs, I think is the phrase we like to use in Australia. So they're kind of cherry picking the good spots. Will it be a bit of a chicken and an egg thing then, where if you live in an area where perhaps people are less likely to be able to afford an EV, but then there aren't the chargers around, so you go, well, why would I buy an EV? Because there's no chargers nearby.
It's so interesting and so interesting to work out how they work it out as well. And so I understand, for example, Western Sydney is a major hub for electric vehicles, and so hopefully there's lots of chargers being rolled out there because that's where the users are. And
There's certainly more than there used to be.
yeah,
Yes.
and one of the reasons, as I understand it, behind sort of the massive use is because a lot of people in Western Sydney travel really long distances to work. And so it makes sense for them to save on petrol to get an electric vehicle. And then you've got kind of wealthy areas. I know that I drove through Samford recently and it was wall to wall Teslas in that place. It's kind of a leafy suburb outside Brisbane, right near the, rolling hills, very pretty, large houses. And yeah, that place on the weekend, you cannot hear a car. It's just all electric vehicles, which is lovely. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of charging stations out there as a result. Where we really need them most, though, is in regional areas. And that's where the government can potentially step up and where we can see a lot of petrol stations having the greatest impact because they've already got locations out there, they've already got infrastructure out there, and, it's easy to spot them and pull over when you need to.
I guess the other challenge as well for the larger metro areas is that you've got to balance against the fact that a decent proportion, certainly not everyone, but a decent proportion of those EV drivers may well be able to charge at home, at which point they're never going near your fancy local charger. Your fancy local charger is probably more for the people who are doing the longer road trip and need to continue going on through your suburb.
That's true, and every time I report about charges, I do tend to get pushback, I've noticed, with people saying, "But I charge at home." And that is gonna be the case for the vast majority of EV owners, especially the ones who have solar because it's cheaper, it's more available. If you work from home, and you have access to a garage, then you're more likely to be charging, in your home. I mean, when you have 300 kilometers or more potentially, stored up in your car, then you probably won't need to charge that often. And certainly you could even do it on the weekends. You don't have to rely on midweek charging. So there's a lot of different considerations to make when you're talking about, where to put these things and where's most convenient for everybody and where they'll actually get used and have a profitable existence.
Of course, the competitor in the EV space is hydrogen, long championed by Toyota. I understand that Toyota's got a van. Tell me about the hydrogen van,
Get in the
Jen.
van, Alex. Yes, the Toyota is testing a hydrogen van, and this is really interesting. Like they're persisting down the hydrogen path. Apparently, Japan, their headquarters decided that Australia was a good place to test this, and Toyota does have a hydrogen center that they've created in Melbourne in Altona, where they can actually refuel these cars in this van. So Toyota also have Mirai, which is like a sedan that they use and they can refuel. But when we're talking about range, they can't go that far from that particular station because there are fewer than 10 hydrogen refueling stations that are available to people. These are very specialized equipment. It's very difficult. I did talk to somebody at one stage from a scientific company who was saying that they needed to they wanted to do a test. I think it was from Brisbane through Adelaide, and as a result, they had to get some specialist equipment along the way in order to refuel because it wasn't possible to go between the two cities without that. That's the definition of range anxiety right there. So this test is going to be really interesting. I think hydrogen is a long way from happening when it comes to regular people cars. When you're talking about sort of harder to abate, carbon emissions, and you're talking about really large vehicles, for example, where huge batteries and swapping out those huge batteries might prove more difficult, I think hydrogen has a better chance of taking off. And the governments, state governments, and the federal government are all looking at it for that reason. I'm not sure how they're going to go with their hydrogen van, but it's going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, from what I've seen talking to people, it's big trucking fleets and things like that where it makes the most sense because you then have dedicated charging depots and also hydrogen doesn't take as long to refuel as it does to charge up an EV. So it kind of when you need to get fueled up and get back on the road, hydrogen makes a lot of sense. But it's kind of like the difference between petrol and diesel. It's not like a competition and one's going to win out of the other. There's room for both. Petrol's more for cars, diesel's more for trucks. I think that would be a similar split maybe with EVs and hydrogen. Big trucks.
It's been interesting to see some of the battery swap stuff that they're doing in China as well.
I was going to bring this up because isn't there an Australian mob that's doing this? And I cannot, off the top of my head, I cannot recall who they are. There's an Australian company. I want to say they might even be Brisbane based again, who was doing the whole truck battery swap thing as their solution.
Yeah, I don't think that we've seen that technology ready in Australia yet. So certainly there's been a lot of discussions around it. But as I understand it, in parts of China, they have trialed this where basically you would rock up to a petrol station and you would have the battery taken off and you would have a new battery put in, and it works particularly well for trucks because then you can charge these things with the trucks not actually there. Now I don't know if how feasible that is. These batteries would have to be very substantial. I wouldn't want to be picking them up. But that's it. That's
I think it's all robots, isn't it? It's just drive over the bay, ka-chunk,
make it
ka-chunk,
happen.
you're
Yeah,
done.
exactly. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's another solution. So I don't think we're necessarily going to see either one of them become mainstream within the next year, but both of them are really interesting sort of cases where there needs to be more research and there needs to be sort of practical applications in place.
So, Jen, in fact, I think the last time we had you on the show was when the two of us were at Fully Charged and MG had just launched the MG4. And it's just won a major accolade, hasn't it?
It has, very exciting. And so, yeah, the MG4 has become car sales car of the year. And this is not the electric car of the year. This is like it beat the competition. It beat a Range Rover. It beat like a Mustang. It was judged to be the best vehicle among all of them. And it's really interesting to me that a hatchback has claimed it as well. So I'm claiming that one for the hatchbacks. And part of it was judged by a team of 10 judges. 8 out of those 10 gave it first place. 2 of them said second place, but they're wrong, so that's fine. Um, and it was interesting because they also sort of factored in the price of it, and not just the price, but the value of this vehicle over time. So potentially we could see more vehicles follow in its stead just because it's done so well, and hopefully we'll see some reaction in the form of more sales for smaller electric vehicles as well.
Well, that just about wraps up this week's episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Jen for joining us this week.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And Jen, I used to ask you to promote where your work appears. It feels like a bit of a redundant question. I should almost ask you, where doesn't your work appear?
It appears everywhere, Alex. You can
She's
find it
here,
on.
she's there, she's everywhere.
I'm omnipresent now. You can find it on aapnews.com.au, or there's an AAP app which is very useful, or you can just Google my name and have a flood of stories appear for you.
And while the listeners are enjoying that flood of stories, where on social media can they find you? And what's your one best EV driving tip?
Ooh, okay. So you can find me on X or whatever Twitter's called this week, at Jen Dudley, or you can find me on Threads because it's weird and funny at Jen DN. In terms of my best EV driving tip, it would be come up with a really good soundtrack because those cars absolutely rip. And if you have a really good soundtrack, you will enjoy the experience so much more.
Sounds like a great idea. I just made a terrible pun and I didn't even mean to. In the meantime, you can catch us at the Vertical Hold homepage at verticalhold.com.au, Vertical Hold on Facebook and on Instagram. You can find Adam and myself across Mastodon and Threads and Blue Sky and whatever, again, Twitter X/Trashfire is called this week.
And thanks everyone for listening in, and to Alex for writing this end piece. He is handsome, witty, deserving of a pay rise, while I will apparently read anything put in front of me. Go fuck yourself, San Diego.